Welcome everybody to the first session called Technical Briefing Synthetic Data Session. I'm Angie Hohensee. I'm the Senior Director of Customer Success at Wirewheel. I'm super excited to be your host today. Welcome everybody here and thank you for joining. First, a few housekeeping items. If you have a question during the discussion, we encourage you to use the Q&A in the toolbar, in the Zoom toolbar. And we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. You're also welcome to interact with attendees through the chat feature in the toolbar. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Up first is Dr. Khaled El-Imam. He's the CEO at Replica Analytics, and Mike Hensey, who is a partner at Hensey Law PLLC. Speakers, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Angie. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Khaled El-Imam. I'll start off this briefing and give you an overview of data synthesis and synthetic data. The presentation is perfect for this audience because this is intended to be an introduction to the topic. So I think that goes well with the responses to the polls. And then Mike will follow with a legal analysis of how to interpret synthetic data generation within the existing regimes today. So let me start off by just giving you an overview of synthetic data uses. So there are really two big use cases, or two major use cases for synthetic data. The first one is around data sharing and data access, and the second one is around data amplification and data augmentation. Given that this is a privacy audience, I'll focus on the data sharing and data access set of use cases. So synthetic data is essentially non-identifiable data. It's a way to create data sets that have a low risk of re-identification. And typical use cases that we see are providing data for AI and data science projects. A lot of organizations are building out their data science teams and AI and machine learning teams. And one of the challenges they're facing is getting access to data. Either it's their internal data sets that they have challenges reusing those data sets for secondary purposes, or non-consented purposes, and also challenges getting access to external data sets from partners. We do a lot of work in the healthcare space, and other challenges is getting access to healthcare data from, say, hospitals or health systems. Another big use case is software testing. A lot of software development teams require realistic data sets to test their applications, and historically, a lot of these organizations, a lot of these groups use production data for their software testing. They pseudonymize the production data and use it. This is becoming more and more of a questionable practice given the risks and the stricter interpretations of secondary uses of data. And so synthetic data can serve that purpose as well, in the sense that you can create synthetic data of your production data and use it for software testing. Another very interesting use case is proof of concept and technology evaluations. So we see a lot of organizations that want to evaluate technology vendors. And in order to do so, they need to give them data sets, realistic data sets to perform these evaluations. And the process of sharing data sets with external vendors or startups or academics that they want to partner with, this process can be quite complicated. It can take many months of audits and contracting. And so to accelerate the technology evaluation process, they set up challenges where synthetic data is provided to those organizations, to those companies, where they then apply their tools on the synthetic data to demonstrate the capabilities that they have. And then, of course, there's open data and open science type applications as well, where synthetic data can be shared more broadly, more easily, as a way to enable replication and sharing of data for scientific purposes. Amplification and augmentation, I think, are really exciting applications of synthetic data in the sense that they allow small data sets to be amplified and allow you to create digital twins or in healthcare settings, virtual patients. It can be used to correct biases in data sets as well. So some interesting applications there, but I'll move on since we want to maintain the focus on the privacy use cases. So now that you know how synthetic data can be used, let me tell you a little bit about how it's generated. So you essentially start off with a real data set, a source data set, and then you fit a model from that source data set. This model is typically an AI or machine learning model of some sort. There are different techniques that can be used, but you essentially fit a model that captures the patterns and statistical properties of that source data set. And then you apply that model to generate synthetic data. So you, for example, sample from that model to create synthetic data. Because the synthetic data is produced from a model, there isn't a one-to-one mapping between the synthetic records and the source data sets. So this is how you're able to provide privacy protection. You've seen synthetic data before in the form of the deep fakes. So all these images on the right-hand side here are fake people, and they were built from fitted models that were trained on images of real people. And then the model can generate fake people that have the same properties as real people. And as you can see, these images look very realistic and they work quite well. And of course, there are fake videos and fake audio, etc. So you can create synthetic data in different forms. But for now, I'm just focused on synthetic structured data. As an example shown below is a synthetic clinical trial data set, for example. So the synthetic clinical trial data set looks very similar as a real data set would look, same patterns and same characteristics. And one of the questions that comes up is, do you have to know how the eventual data set will be used at the end in order to create a synthetic, to create a model or to create synthetic data? And the answer is generally no. These generative models or synthetic data generation models are sufficiently powerful that they capture a lot of the patterns in the data set. So you don't need to know the data uses in advance. The models capture a lot of the subtle patterns in the data set so that when you perform your analytics on the eventual data, synthetic data, you're still able to replicate some of the able to replicate some of the patterns in the original data set quite well. And I'll show you some examples of that. So the next kind of evolution of application of synthetic data is simulators. So these models that we create, these generative models, or they're also called simulators, they can be put in a catalog or in an exchange or in a marketplace, and then you can provide access to the simulators to data consumers. So data consumers would then go in, search for simulators for the types of information or data sets they want, and then generate data sets on demand. And this data generation can be scalable, so they can generate 100 records, 1 million records, 10 million records. It actually doesn't matter. Once you have the model, you can generate large amounts of data set from them. And it's not a function of how large the source data was. You can have a smaller source data set and then generate a larger data set, synthetic data set from that afterwards. So the advantage here, of course, is that you don't give access to real data to the data consumers. You give them access to simulators or models of the data. And we found that data custodians and data controllers are more comfortable sharing models than they are sharing raw data sets. So this is one effective way to enable broad access to data set to data consumers within an organization or even external to the organization, just by providing access to different types of data simulators. So the two big questions that come up with synthetic data are, what are the privacy risks for synthetic data? And then second question is, how good is it? So I'll touch upon those briefly before closing off. So there are some privacy models for evaluating the risk of identification for synthetic data sets. And here's an example of an evaluation of privacy risks, essentially identity disclosure risks for synthetic data on two health data sets. One is the Washington Hospital Discharge Database, and the other one is the Canadian COVID-19 case database. And they vary in size. One is 650,000 individuals, and the other one is around 90,000. And here we look at the risk of identification for fully synthetic data set as well as the original data. And we use a threshold of 0.09. So 0.09 is a commonly used threshold, at least for the sharing of health data. used by the European Medicines Agency and Health Canada and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid as thresholds for what's deemed to be acceptable non-identifiable data sets. So as you can see that the synthetic data sets tend to be about 5 to 10 times lower than the threshold and also have a rate identification risk that's lower than the original data. This is a common pattern that we've seen if synthetic data is generated well and generally used or generally accepted approaches. For example, if you don't overfit your models when you're generating synthetic data, then the privacy risks have tended to be quite low. And note these are the privacy risks without including any additional controls. So this is just the privacy risk or identity disclosure risk from the data set by itself. If you add to that security controls, privacy controls, contractual controls to manage residual risk, then your overall risk of identification can be significantly lower. So the evidence on the privacy risks from synthetic data that has been accumulating over the last few years or a couple of years has been positive in the sense that the risks have been found to be quite low. But of course, there's always a privacy utility trade-off. So if you maximize privacy or get very low privacy, there is going to be an impact on your data utility. So the next question is, have we achieved an acceptable trade-off between privacy and utility with synthetic data? So I'll give you an example just to illustrate what you would expect to see with synthetic data. Here's an analysis of the Canadian COVID-19 data set. On the x-axis, and this graph is date reported from the 1st of January 2020, and we're modeling death. So this is a mortality curve. And as you can see, the first wave happened in 2020 springtime and then calmed down over the summer. And this goes until the end of November. You can see the second wave is just about to start. And so we built this model with real and synthetic data. We factored out all the other confounders that have an impact on mortality and just looked at time. And as you can see that the pattern from the real and synthetic data is very similar. It's not exactly the same, because if they're exactly the same, then you're essentially replicating the original data. But the patterns are very similar and you draw the same conclusions from the real and the synthetic data sets. And here's another analysis from the same data set. We looked at mortality by age group, again, factoring out all the other confounders. And we can see strong concordance between real and synthetic data sets in terms of the estimated mortality and the 95% confidence interval. And the numbers are at the top are the confidence interval overlaps. So how much these two confidence intervals overlap each other for each one of the age groups. And again, they're not exactly the same, because that would be a problem if they were, but there's high concordance. So this pattern is something we've seen ourselves and other folks working and analysts working in the synthetic data space, is that when generated properly, when done well, the concordance in the analytic results between real and synthetic data tends to be quite high, which is why it brings me to my original statement in the opening slide. So I think that is the future of data sharing synthetic data. The evidence that's accumulating around privacy and utility is quite high. One of the main advantages of data synthesis is that the process is largely automated, so it addresses some of the challenges with historical techniques that have been used for creating non-identifiable data, which required a lot of skill and expertise to execute on, whereas data synthesis requires less, not zero, of course, but less, just because it's a much more automatable process to produce these data sets. So with that, I'll pass it on to Mike, and he will give us a perspective on the legal standing of synthetic data.
Great, thank you, Khaled. If you could jump to the next slide. So there's three kind of legal issues I want to address when it comes to synthetic data. The first one is the act of creating synthetic data relies on using actual data, the original raw data set, which is personal data under most privacy laws. And so does that act of creating synthetic data require anything under privacy laws? What are the obligations that apply to that act, because it is processing actual personal data? The second issue I'm going to address is because very few organizations will have this capability in-house, usually you're going to be working with a third party. So you're going to have to share that original raw data set with personal data with a third party. And so what are the issues there? And then the final question, kind of the ultimate question here, is that resulting synthetic data set. How, if at all, is that regulated under privacy law? So to jump into the first question, is the use of the original data set to generate or evaluate synthetic data sets restricted or regulated under data protection law? And the answer is clearly yes, it is. There are a number of obligations under data protection law you'll have to think about when it comes to generating synthetic data. One, under many privacy laws, primarily the GDPR and laws that are based on the GDPR, is this notion of legal basis. Do you have a legal basis for this type of processing of the personal information? Do you need consent of the data subjects to use actual personal data to generate a synthetic data set? And the answer around consent is likely no. There are other legal bases that can come into play and will almost certainly apply in this case. And under the GDPR, the most likely and obvious one is the legitimate interest legal basis. And as you may know, relying on the legitimate interest basis under the GDPR requires a balancing test. It's a balance between the interests of the data subject or a third party in the processing, evaluated against the risk to the fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subject. And as Khaled described, there are a lot of really compelling use cases for synthetic data. So the interests of the data subject, and in fact, interests of other parties, researchers and the like, are likely to be very, very high. The risks to the data subject are likely to be very, very low. In fact, there's arguably a strong benefit to the data subject because the alternative to using synthetic data that would be generating using their personal information would be to actually use their personal information for the research or the testing purpose for which the synthetic data is intended. And so the weighing is very strongly going to come out in favor of using this data to generate synthetic data because it's really in everybody's interest. Other obligations, I mentioned consent earlier. There's other laws that don't have this legal basis concept, but do require consent for a number of uses. Khaled mentioned that one of the strong use cases is in the medical space, so HIPAA is likely to come into play. And HIPAA requires individual authorization for a lot of different data uses, but there are a number of exceptions for which individual authorization is not required. One is uses or disclosures to create de-identified information. And another is healthcare operations, which includes the creation of de-identified health data or a limited data set. Now, synthetic data is distinguishable from traditional de-identification in some of the ways Khaled mentioned. Most notably, in traditional de-identification, an individual record that relates to an individual still relates to that individual once it's been de-identified. It's just the obvious identifiers have been removed from it, either the direct and or indirect identifiers. Whereas synthetic data, there's not a one-to-one correlation between an individual record and an individual. Nevertheless, this language in HIPAA that uses de-identification as an example should pretty clearly apply to this type of processing as well, because it is creating information that is not identifiable back to the individual. And so I think there's a very compelling and strong case for saying that this type of use does fall within one or more of those HIPAA exceptions. Of course, there are other obligations under data protection law, like data security and transparency. And so to the extent that you are using real data to generate synthetic data, that should be done in a secure environment. There should be reasonable transparency around that. There should be a language in the privacy notice or the like that says, this data may be used to generate other non-personal data or something like that. But those are relatively simple things, or things that should already be in place in any organization that's processing personal data. So the barriers under the law to the generation of synthetic data are relatively low and can be dealt with. The second legal question I wanted to quickly address, and this one's fairly straightforward, is if you are sharing data with a third party for them to generate synthetic data for you, what are the obligations? Well, these are the obligations that most of you are probably already familiar with around sharing data with a service provider. Presumably the entity that would be sharing, that would be creating synthetic data from a real data set isn't doing anything else with that original data set containing personal information. So this would fall into the provisions under most privacy laws that allows for the use of service providers to provide services on another organization's behalf. And under the GDPR, that would be a data processor. Under the California Consumer Privacy Act, that would be a service provider. Under HIPAA, that would be a business associate. That kind of sharing is allowed under these privacy laws. There's some conditions and requirements. There may be a duty of care in selecting a service provider that can handle this data appropriately. There may be a number of contractual obligations. For example, under the GDPR, there's the Article 28 requirements for contract provisions for sharing with a data processor. And these would be things like limiting the use. You can't use the data for any other purpose than providing this service, which would be the generation of synthetic data. You need to have data security. There might be some restrictions on subcontracting and some obligations to assist the controller in meeting its own obligations. But as long as those kinds of contracts are in place, there shouldn't be an issue or a problem with sharing the data. So the final issue is, does the resulting data, is it regulated by privacy law? Now, I mentioned before, synthetic data is different from traditional de-identified data in that there's not a one-to-one correlation between a record in a synthetic data set and an actual individual. And I would say that if you go through the definitions of personal data or personal information under most privacy laws, this is going to fall outside. And if it doesn't meet that definition, if this data is not data about an actual living individual, it's not going to be personal data. And that means it can really be used for any purpose, including shared publicly. And so, if you look at the different definitions, as I mentioned under the GDPR definition is information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. Well, no record in a synthetic data set relates to an identified or identifiable natural person. On the whole, the data set might relate to a group of individuals. And under CCPA, which has a very similar definition to the GDPR, information that identifies, relates to, or describes, et cetera, a particular consumer or household. Synthetic data does not describe a particular consumer data or household. And there's even an exception for aggregate consumer information, which is information that relates to a group or categories of individuals, which a set of synthetic data may do, but that is within the exception to the definition under the CCPA. Similarly, the HIPAA definition talks about relating to an individual reasonably, can be reasonably used to identify an individual. And as Khaled said, a properly created synthetic data set cannot. So I would argue that under these definitions and similar definitions in other privacy laws, this does not meet the definition of personal data. It is not data that relates to actual living individuals, and therefore it is outside the scope of these laws. All right, that's all I had. Turn it back over to Angie for any final any final notes.